So I've assigned to you two history readings within Module 7. The first that we just covered, which is titled Woodrow Wilson and the Great War, and the second, which is the first chapter in a great book about 20th century world history titled Modern Times, written by the author Paul Johnson. It's a long 1,000-page tome, but it's an amazing book if you want to understand all of the details of 20th century history. So this chapter, the first chapter in Johnson's book, is titled A Relativistic World. And he says something really interesting at the beginning of the chapter that when you think about it more and more, it makes a lot of sense of the 20th and 21st century that we live in. There's one event that Johnson argues gave birth to the modern world. And that event was Einstein's discovery of relativity. So in the first 3 or 4 pages of this chapter, Johnson is going to go through the details of Einstein's experiment in which he shows the truth of relativity. So what does relativity amount to? I'm not a scientist, but let me do my best as a teacher of political philosophy to kind of translate what's going on here. What Einstein argued is that your measure of something within space depends upon your perspective. So if you're judging the movement by which something is moving in time and space in the universe, where you stand has an influence on the thing itself. Now, it's very interesting because about 2 or so modules before, I mentioned this idea of pragmatism. And I want you to think real quickly here about pragmatism and relativity. The pragmatist, and this was William James, argued that all claims of truth amount to a judgment made on reality. And for that judgment to be true, James argues, it has to make a concrete difference. So James had argued when defining pragmatism that a lot of the past works of philosophers and rationalists and intellectualists must be discarded out of hand because these individuals believed that everything in this world had an objective truth to it. And what James is suggesting in pragmatism is that it's the subject, it's the observer that makes something what it is. And that subject or observer makes something what it is by giving meaning to the outside world. Now, what's happening with relativity? What Einstein meant in discovering relativity was not that all things are relative, that all absolutes are relative, that all morals are relative, that everything is a matter of perspective, but that measurement of time and space is relative. But what Johnson tells us at the beginning of this chapter is that Einstein's theory of relativity is wrongly and popularly translated to mean that moral relativism is true. So here, think about the pessimism that I mentioned before in defining the European experience of the beginning of the 20th century. A shift takes place after the 19th century, and men fighting this war begin to have doubt about all things, all truth, all value. And then Einstein discovers relativity, and they're like, oh, there it is. Everything is relative. That means that everything can be invented anew. And Einstein is horrified by the fact that his scientific work had lent itself, right, to this kind of dangerous idea that we can make truth and define value however we want. More likely, we can define it by just willing whatever we want. There are 2 other individuals in this chapter that Johnson spends a lot of time with. In addition to Einstein, he'll talk about Marx and Marx's influence upon the modern world. Marx, who we'll study in the next 2 modules, is an individual who argues that really everything in this world is a matter of historical dialectic. Everything in this world is a matter of a power suppressing a disempowered type of person. And that what we're going to arrive at the end of human history, Marx argues, is an absolute state of equality because there'll be no powerful holding power over a powerless. Marx's theory of this kind of turning upside down of Western civilization and the movement towards an egalitarian norm is a second tradition that catches hold during this time. And it lends itself to the growth of the prominence of someone who had done work on the human mind and dreams and all the rest, a man named Sigmund Freud. Freud brings into play this idea that, yes, there are these antagonisms within the world. There are these antagonisms between people, but most of the antagonisms are brought on not because the wealthy suppress the poor, but because this other entity, civilization, is actually what is oppressing every individual human being. And what Einstein says, the end effect of civilization impressing itself upon every individual consciousness is a set of neuroses that form in the human mind, a set of fears that form in the human mind that made themselves expressed after men went and fought in World War I and dealt with the horrors of war. Johnson suggests the following: men coming back with shell shock began to show these neuroses, and Freud, as a thinker who claimed that civilization had too much of a powerful hold on the individual consciousness, all of a sudden became prominent, became one of the most powerful voices within Europe. So you have, on the one hand, Einstein's theory of relativity, lending itself to moral relativism, and you have this Marxist Freudian idea coming into being in the world whereby a revolution will be necessary to make things right. The final individual who I want to bring to your attention in this chapter, A Relativistic World, is another thinker named Friedrich Nietzsche, who introduces at the end of the 19th century the notion that God is dead. Now, Nietzsche has no claim to understanding whether God is or is not, but what he suggests is that belief in God, broadly speaking, has disappeared from the European intellectual scene. So you take a Nietzsche, you take a Freud, you take a Marx, you take the mistranslation of Einstein's theory of relativity, and you have this stew that creates, on the one hand, this pessimism, but on the other hand, this growing will to power that will exert itself as we watch over European history in the first half of the 20th century.